I'm delighted to be speaking at the launch of this campaign today. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I think it's fair to say that this isn't an issue that cuts neatly along ideological and party lines. In fact, it's an issue that cuts across them. And I recall having dinner with the late Bob Crow and Nigel Farage. Yep, me, Bob, and Nigel. Before the three of us appeared on a November 2010 edition of BBC Radio 4's Any Questions. It's fair to say it was one of the more surreal dinners I've had. But what was interesting was that both Nigel and Bob obviously came from opposite ends of the political spectrum. Bob on the far left and Nigel very much on the right, but they were united on one thing, and that was their mutual dislike of the European Union. Now, given the importance of this issue to the national interest and the future of our country, I don't think we can allow tribalism and party politics to stand in the way of people like Damien and I, on the other side of the argument to Bob and Nigel, from making the most effective case that we can together for Britain's membership of the European Union. So I'm really pleased to be making the case for the EU today alongside Damien. This sector's voice is a crucial one. According to the poll conducted for the group British Future, I see Matthew standing at the back over there, the poll that Survation carried out for them last month, most people have not actually made up their minds yet where they stand on Britain's membership of the European Union. But what that poll did make clear was that really it's voices outside of politics who are far more trusted advocates in persuading the British people of the case for the EU. Alongside economists, small businessmen, fishermen, farmers, the poll found that university vice-chancellors, I see some smiles to my right, are the voices outside of politics who are most trusted when they talk about whether Britain should stay in the European Union. So it's very welcome indeed that the universities have launched this Universities for Europe campaign. EU membership, as Dame Julia outlined, matters for the sector, with EU R&D funding of £727 million a year for our institutions here, a 15.5% boost for the UK science and research budget, British businesses often receiving the most funding of any organisations in the UK, increased innovation in the UK, cross-border collaboration on projects enabling countries to achieve more for less compared to projects restricted to the national level, and so on. The list goes on. The Out campaign, of course, will argue that if we exited, we would be able to use the monies that would otherwise be going to the European Union to spend on R&D. But again, as Julia has said, knowledge and scholarship are borderless. Research collaboration transcends national boundaries, and surely we want the brightest and the best from the EU coming here, bringing their ideas and developing them in the UK. Full disclosure, I myself benefited from the EU's Erasmus Socrates student exchange programme when I read English law and French law at the University of Manchester. I spent a year studying French law at the University of Burgundy in France. That experience broadened my own horizons and gave me a much better understanding of a different legal system, which then informed my practice when I became a solicitor later on. Like all Manchester alumni, I was proud that it was a team at Manchester University that discovered graphene, that incredibly flexible material that is 200 times stronger than steel. What many don't know is that the team that worked on that project, on the graphene project, received startup funding for their work from the EU in 2007, 3 years before they got the Nobel Prize for their work. And the EU went on from 2013 to invest £23 million helping to establish the National Graphene Institute in Manchester. We've already heard in detail from Julia why continued EU membership is so important, not just for Manchester, but for all of our universities. So I want to use this opportunity today to offer some thoughts on how the broader Yes campaign, of which universities are a very important part, can win this referendum. First, given that we know, as I said, the voices outside of politics are more persuasive than the ones in politics, I think it would make sense for a non-politician to head up the umbrella Yes campaign to the extent it has a nominal head when it's established. In truth, the campaign will need a cast of voices that look and sound like modern Britain, taking in all our different regions, our different diverse communities, women, men, the young, the old, everybody. This is not a campaign that can be won by captains of industry and, dare I say it, politicians lecturing Britain from lecterns. It's got to be a grassroots, bottom-up campaign if it is to win. We need a broad range of faces of the campaign who are authentic, credible, and can win people over to the cause. Not only universities and businesses, environmental organisations, consumer groups, the creative industries and others. The potential breadth of the Yes campaign is a big strength, and we've got to harness it. Second, we have got to make the argument from a local as well as a national perspective. The business case for the EU is clearly a strong one, but I think general managers of local plants, factories, workplaces, branch offices will be more effective advocates than the CEO adding his or her name to a letter from the great and the good extolling the virtues of the EU in the FT or the Times. These local actors have got to be authorised and encouraged to speak out and explain the benefits for their local area. Because if the person who gives you your payslip and rosters your hours every month tells you of the impact of leaving the European Union on your immediate workplace, you will sit up and listen. Third, although we will necessarily need to point to the risks of out, what does that look like? We have got to make a positive and optimistic case for staying in. That is one lesson we should heed from Scotland. Although unsuccessful, the Yes campaign there owned the positive story in that independence referendum campaign, which gave them a certain dynamism and energy. Now, looking at this EU referendum campaign, it helps that we are yes to stay in. I'm not arguing for no. But we've got to foster that same sense of positivity around our continued membership. And, you know, I've always thought that the Eurosceptics tell a very defeatist and negative story about Britain. It is a narrative that suggests that whenever we want to get things done in the European Union, we are run over by recalcitrant fellow EU members standing in our way. The truth is very different, and we've got to say so. The UK has been regarded as a shrewd operator in the EU. You speak to any of our European partners about what it is like to negotiate with us. And until the current Prime Minister came to office, we've traditionally been very effective at marshalling a majority behind the UK position on the European Council. Far from being overrun, being effective and leading players in Europe, as President Obama indicated last week, has helped the UK keep our seat at the international leaders' table. This is fundamental to our national interest. My fourth reflection is that we must not allow this referendum to be simply framed around issues of trade and immigration. The trade argument is very, very important, given that most of our exports go to the EU, and we currently have the biggest current account deficit since 1830. We've got to continue to make the trade case, as we can't turn our back in that context on our largest export market. And of course, on the other side, the No campaign will want this to be all about immigration. They will want that to be central, given its toxicity as an issue. But there is a much broader argument to be made for the EU, from tackling challenges such as climate change to cross-border crime, that has got to be part of the argument too. In particular, we must remind people of the peace part, of the peace and prosperity that comes with the EU. We cannot allow the No campaign to assert that the relative peace we in the main have enjoyed in Europe following the EU's establishment was or is a given. The role the EU plays in making Europe and the world a safer place could be further reinforced if the Iran nuclear agreement proves to be successful. The EU's High Representatives, first Baroness Ashton and now Federica Mogherini, are recognised to have played a very important role in facilitating that agreement. In the end, we are much stronger, much more powerful working together with like-minded countries to build a safer world. The No campaign harks back, frankly, to a world that no longer exists and would make Britain weaker and less influential. Finally, we cannot be the ones in this campaign arguing for the status quo. The EU isn't in stasis. It is a structure that needs to adapt and change to reflect the needs of today and tomorrow, and change in a way that systems in countries do too. So we've got to fight to stay in a changed and reformed EU, and for us on the centre-left of British politics, we've got to paint a picture of what a more progressive EU looks like. Any reform agenda is going to clearly need to address the way free movement works in an EU which looks very different now to the EU which it was when it was created. Clearly, you can't have free movement of goods and services without free movement of people. But the way in which our benefit system operates and employment rules are enforced in this context will need to be addressed. I've made it very clear to business leaders that if they see renegotiation as some vehicle through which to roll back the EU's social agenda on things like working hours, agency workers, voice in the workplace and so on, then we will struggle to convince working people of the case to stay in. The CBI tells us that staying in is in their members' commercial interests, so I trust they and others will tell Number 10 that that is their priority here, not further liberalising our labour market, which is already the third most liberal labour market in the OECD. Whilst I have little sympathy for governing Syriza in Greece, I have great sympathy for the Greek people. The troubles of the Eurozone are many and varied, but part of the problem has definitely been the excessive austerity that Germany demanded, leading to the shrinkage of several economies with great human cost. Progressives, like the Labour Party, have got to be clear that we oppose this excessive austerity and remind people that the EU is not some poster boy for austerity. There are other powerful social democratic voices in Europe, the French and the Italian governments in particular. I go to Italy on Wednesday to meet with the government there, who take a very different view and a different approach. And as we seek not only to work with multinational companies to advance growth and global progress, but we seek to also ensure they pay their fair share and abide by the rules, working across borders, as those companies do with our EU partners, is a no-brainer. But we've got to spell out how the EU already does this and can more effectively do so in the future to ensure globalisation doesn't exacerbate inequalities and help ensure more can share in the benefits that it can bring. So, to conclude, I never got a vote in the last EU referendum. I wasn't alive. But I passionately believe that in a different world, the more networked our country is, the more we can exercise influence to improve the lives of the British people and build a fairer, more equal and prosperous world. There is no better network for us to use to do this than the EU. And making this argument with passion and emotion is a must, because so often passion and emotion trump facts. Because when the vote does come, it is crucial we persuade our fellow countrymen with head and heart to vote yes to stay in. Thank you very much for listening.